Get started. So you all may have heard that announcement, so just want everybody to be aware that we are recording this. Our speaker, Don Weldon, graciously agreed to let us record this program, which helps make it accessible to folks who just, for whatever reason, couldn't make it in person or online today. So, all right. I'll be really quick with the introduction because Don has so much interesting stuff to talk about. So Don Weldon, some of you may have seen him in previous here or other venues. He's done so many talks on Cape Cod history. Actually, he's the author of 5 books on Cape Cod. Pardon? Five books and more to come. I understand more to come. So we'll have that to look forward to. And his most recent book, which he has over there, Historic Storms of Cape Cod. And Don has worked as a tour guide, and he's an award-winning newspaper editor, writer, and designer. So anyway, I've been really excited about this program because I'm new to the Cape, and so learning more history about the Cape, and I know Don knows so much about Cape history and storms and other things that he may touch on as well. So without any further delay, we'll let Don start his program. Thank you.
Thank you. Everybody, and thank you for bringing the elements getting here today. Actually, here on Cape Cod, there are so many accounts of horrible storms that occurred here, and I'm going to touch on just some of those here today. There were many others too, and I go back into mostly the 20th century and the 21st century. Well, one thing about storms here on Cape Cod, and I'm sure maybe some of you fall into this category, whenever there's a storm, you head to the beach. And it's like a spectator sport, you know, people feel like they have to go out and see what's going on. My friend, the late Nan Turner Waldron, who wrote a book called Journey to Outermost House, she once wrote, "Every one of us needs to feel beyond self. To feel small measured against distant horizons, to feel powerless against the winds, to feel voiceless against the thunder of the storm." And Cape Cod has a lot of special features which can affect the damage that storms do here. The sustained high winds can push seawater far high above high tide levels, especially in the enclosed bays. Buzzards Bay collects high water and hurricane winds from the south. Cape Cod Bay fills up during nor'easters. The shallows east and south of the Cape get very choppy in storms, much in the same way that the North Sea does. And we get a variety of different storms around here, but mostly the big ones are the hurricanes and the nor'easters. The name hurricane actually comes from the Mayan god Huracan. And that, the story goes that Huracan sent his thunderbolts and ferocious windstorms upon the people and blew the seas into raging fury that swept all creatures before him into death and destruction. Cape mariners would later come face to face with Huracan's towering anger and developed a very healthy respect for it. And here's something to remember about hurricanes. When they get all crazy on the TV, you know, start talking about, you know, hurricane warnings and all this stuff, and they're watching a hurricane down in the Bahamas. One thing you got to remember is about these storms. There's 2 different kinds usually with hurricanes. First, there's the ones, they're Cape Verde systems. They develop off the coast of Africa, and they take over a week to cross the Atlantic usually. And there's also storms that develop down near the Bahamas. They accelerate up the coast, and they're also smaller storms. They tend to be smaller. And they don't give a heck of a lot of lead time either. So a rule of thumb to remember, a storm has to be at 72 degrees west longitude in the Bahama area for it to have a chance of hitting us. So if that storm gets no further west than, say, 68 degrees, it's not going to hit us. The chances are very good it's going to pass out to sea. If it's at 72 degrees west longitude, it has a very good chance of getting caught up in the jet stream and hitting us directly. There was a hurricane named Lee just last year, in September of 23 that passed just off to the east of us, missed us by about 150, 200 miles. If Lee was at 68 degrees longitude, down in the Bahamas. If Lee had been at 72, we would have been hit, but it wasn't, it was further out, so it just missed us. And we haven't had one now, hurricane in 33 years, a real legitimate hurricane has not hit here, so we're due. And nor'easters, well, we all know those, every winter. And Cape Cod is right in the path of these storms. They develop in the latitudes, usually between Georgia and New Jersey. And that's within 100 miles east or west of the East Coast. And they progress generally northeastward and typically attain maximum intensity near New England or the maritime provinces of Canada. So one of the most potent and devastating nor'easters that ever hit Cape Cod was actually the subject of my last book. Cape Cod and the Portland Gale of 1898. I didn't call it the Portland Gale because of what it did to Portland, Maine so much, what it did to the steamer Portland. The steamer Portland ventured out from Boston on the night of November 26, 1898. That was Thanksgiving weekend. Never came back, was never seen again. Vanished under the waves of Cape Cod Bay because it got caught up in the storm that ended up being a lot worse than anybody thought. It was described by the Boston Sunday Post as a night to try men's souls. It was a night when the strongest of men trembled and when women wept. It was a night that should witness deeds of human bravery. It was a night of agony and of death. It was a night when the Coast Guardsman was remembered. And this storm was particularly devastating here on Cape Cod and also what it did to the steamer Portland. This magnificent ship, this was one of the main methods of transportation between Boston and Portland in those days. You could either take the steamer, and it was this beautiful, luxurious, state-of-the-art type of paddle steamer. And people just loved to travel on it, and had almost celebrity type status. And it was heading for Portland, Maine, from Boston that night, leaving at 7 o'clock. And unfortunately, what happened was there were almost 200 people on board. None of them made it. So it's often been referred to as the Titanic of New England in a lot of cases because of what happened. Otherwise, during that storm, besides the Portland, you also had 141 vessels being wrecked. 40 were from Cape Cod. 456 lives were lost at sea during the Portland Gale. And the Portland itself started out leaving Boston, and there were warnings about bad weather coming, but they didn't know how bad it was going to be. It started snowing a half an hour later. As the Portland progressed up the coast of Massachusetts, storm got worse and worse. By 9 o'clock, there were hurricane force winds, and pieces of the steamer were starting to break up. And there were all kinds of people that were actually witnessing this from shore. And as things got worse and worse, and up around 9 o'clock, it was thought to have drift out to sea. And then around 3 a.m., it's out over Massachusetts Bay. It was originally thought to have run aground been wrecked off of Provincetown and Truro. But eventually it was found out that it went under the waves over Stellwagen Bank. These were 60-foot waves that were hitting during this storm, taller than the ship's smokestacks. It is now, the remains of it are now in 460 feet of water over in the Stellwagen Bank Marine Sanctuary. The keeper at Highland Light recorded a wind gust of 90 miles an hour during the height of the storm. Other places hit 100 miles an hour. Up in Hull, the life-saving service station there, they estimated that the visibility at sea was about 100 yards at best. And when you can't see 100 yards in front of you out at sea, it's kind of devastating, and I covered that whole scenario a little bit more in my Shipwrecks of Cape Cod book. Within 2 hours, there were nearly 200 vessels from Maine to Martha's Vineyard that were just scrambling for some kind of safe harbor during the storm. And there were also the light ships. You might have heard about the light ships that used to be off of the coast of Cape Cod. These were basically floating lighthouses. And one of them was the Pollock Rip light ship that was stationed off of Chatham, anchored firmly there for a long time. But during this storm, the anchors, it was ripped from its anchors. This ship ended up off the coast of Delaware because that's how bad this storm was. They were able to bring it back eventually, but that just gives you an idea of how bad that storm was. The harbors of Provincetown and Martha's Vineyard, boats were being thrown around like toys, tossed around like toys. This is the scene in Provincetown. Devastated all the piers there, but one or two. There used to be quite a few more there. This was a real nail in the coffin to what was left of the whaling industry at that time. Provincetown, about 36 schooners were just being thrown around. Same thing down in Martha's Vineyard, Vineyard Haven. 50 of them thrown around like toys. Unfortunately, 2 of those were line schooners. They were carrying the mineral lime. And one thing I didn't know before I started researching that book was lime, when it gets wet, it ignites. So that's what happened with these 2 ships. They caught fire. And as they're being thrown around in the harbor, on one of them, the men were basically deciding whether they would drown or burn. They got to a point where they were close enough, though, they were being thrown around in the harbor, and eventually they were able to jump onto another ship that was also in trouble, but not on fire. So they were able to actually survive. But that just gives you an idea. And one of the line schooners ended up burning for over 3 weeks before it finally went out. December 19th, this was November 27th that it caught fire. December 19th is when the fire finally went out, after it sat there burning that whole time. This was the scene on the Upper Cape and Mid Cape, the railroad tracks in Sandwich, also in West Barnstable and Northborough. They were all washed out by high tides, storm tides. And that delayed train service for several days, and trees were down Cape wide during this storm. And this happened frequently during all these other storms that I'll mention. Here, there were trees down, power out. It just ended up being a devastating scene. During the Portland gale like that, and especially during the 1938 hurricane, also known as the Long Island Express or the Great New England Hurricane of 1938. They didn't start naming storms, hurricanes, until 1953. That's when they started giving them female names. And then in 1979, they started with added male names to it as well. Before that, between 1950 and 53, they would use a phonetic alphabet kind of way of naming storms. So the worst one during that stretch was in 1950, was one called Hurricane Dog. So they would have D as in dog. So that one actually brushed Cape Cod and was hit some areas of the Cape pretty hard. But this one, the 38 hurricane, killed 600 people here in New England. About 17 or 18 on the Upper Cape area, which was hit particularly hard. This storm started out down, actually across the Atlantic, came up through the Bahamas and shot up the East Coast. It had a northward speed of 60 miles an hour. That's unheard of with a lot of storms. A forward motion of 60 miles an hour. So it was like a freight train coming up. Nobody knew it was coming. And even when it hit land, when it made landfall over Long Island and Connecticut, it was still moving northward at 51 miles an hour, which was, nobody had ever seen anything like that. They had sustained winds of 121 miles an hour recorded at the Blue Hill Observatory outside of Boston. 186-mile-an-hour wind gusts during that storm. And this was the real destructive force here on the Cape, the storm surges. 18 to 25 feet in Buzzards Bay. So 25 feet, 20 feet of water in downtown Providence, Rhode Island. 8 feet of water in the streets of Falmouth. This is what the scene was in Falmouth. And one of the newspaper editors in Wareham, just across Buzzards Bay, described it the next day. Then came the dawn. Words cannot describe it. To the writer whose own newspaper plant had been under 6 feet of water, the thought came to him, as it must have to all who sustained like losses, that the blow was too great to realize where to begin, what to do. Nobody knew, but everybody began to do something, futile as it might seem. And there were a lot of fatalities, as I mentioned, but in Falmouth, there was a case where a woman had drowned after her car ran out of gas on Beach Road near the Moore Pavilion. Her and her nephew had been out running errands, and they had no idea that a storm like this was coming. They were out and about, heading back, and they saw that the gauge on their car, the gas gauge, was getting near empty. And the nephew said, "Should we stop and get gas?" She said, "No, let's just get home." Well, they didn't make it home. They ended up running out of gas down there by the water. And he went to go get gas. And when he came back, she was gone. She had gotten out of the car apparently during the storm. Some witnesses saw her get out of the car, and then she kind of just disappeared. Because the visibility from the storm was so bad. They found her body the next day. There was another couple also who ended up having to climb on the roof of their house because they were out in their yard. Water comes rushing in. They go up to inside the house, the water comes in the house. They go to the second floor, still not enough. Then they climb on the roof. The water ends up ripping the roof off of the house, carrying them on a very long ride until it finally collided with another house, killed them both instantly. And then there were 5 people inside a cottage in the Grey Gables area of Bourne. They were all killed when the cottage dropped into Buzzards Bay and then was swept into the Cape Cod Canal. Finally came to rest against the north side of the Bourne Bridge. And the victims ended up being removed from a hole in the cottage's roof. This is some of the other scenes in that area. This is the Buzzards Bay train station, right near the downtown area, right around where you turn into Mass Maritime Academy, and you can see the cars underwater here, and the train bridge, the railroad bridge, right over in the background. And then that's another scene from Falmouth on the right. And scientists and all over the place were actually convinced the water rose there because it ended up being caught in a bottleneck. The water just came shooting right up through Buzzards Bay, and it had nowhere to go, had no place to go. So the tide was rising just as the wind was rising too. So it was a perfect storm kind of scenario with all these elements happening at the same time. So with that in mind, with all of the devastation here, the next storm, they said we got to prepare better, and they started developing more warning systems. And fortunately, during the hurricane of September 14th, 1944, nobody was killed on the Cape. There were far fewer fatalities during this storm. It was another Category 3 hurricane, much as 38 was. And this one, though, arrived 3 hours after high tide, so it was kind of the midway point. And the mid and lower Cape actually sustained more damage than that of the upper Cape. There were fatalities, however, aboard the Vineyard Lightship, number 73, stationed right near Cuttyhunk Island on the mouth of Vineyard Sound. That ended up going to the bottom during the storm, the Great Atlantic Hurricane, it was called. 12 men died because they were under orders to remain at their station. And the Vineyard ended up having to ride out the storm during the early morning hours of September 15th. And there were 105-mile-an-hour winds battering the area. A storm surge of 8 to 10 feet. They could see flares coming from the Vineyard Lightship. from the shore. And after a few hours, it disappeared because the ship had disappeared. They ended up recovering some parts of the ship. The lightship's bell is now on display at the New Bedford waterfront. Over in Dennis, particularly West Dennis, this was the scene at the Lighthouse Inn on West Dennis Beach. Lower County Road was under 8 feet of water, and the Lighthouse Inn actually had its worst damage ever. They had just put in a new dining room and during June of that year, 3 months earlier. They had built this whole new dining room addition on the side of the inn. And it ended up being destroyed and washed into Weir Creek in the back of the beach there. On the other side of the road, 27 cottages near the inn were also destroyed during that storm. This was the scene in Chatham. Also, there's another picture I have from Chatham that's on the cover of the book. But in Chatham, boats were swept from the Stage Harbor shore, piled up on Turns Island. The Marine Railway building collapsed. A couple of wharves were swept away. Winds blew the steeple of the Chatham Universalist Church, and the Morris Island Bridge, which is shown here on the right, was totally washed out. And also, there were so many trees down that German POWs from Camp Edwards were recruited, and they helped with the cleanup of the downed trees all over the Cape. 4 sawmills were brought in by the US Army to turn all those trees into lumber. So it would be another 10 years before you had an actual direct hit from a hurricane again. It wasn't just one hurricane, it was 2. Imagine what the Weather Channel would be like today if you had 2 hurricanes hit an area within 12 days of each other. That's what happened in 1954. Carol and Edna were the 2 that hit. The last century had 4 significant hurricanes all come within a 16-year period, and Carol and Edna came within 12 days of each other. You could see the path that they took. Carol was actually very similar to the 1938 hurricane. Edna actually kind of curved and went right over the Cape before it passed to the north. Carol was a category 3. It coincided with high tide as it moved northward, had a forward speed of 40 miles an hour. That too is pretty quick. Storm surge 14 feet, sustained winds 80 to 100 miles an hour. High tide was 10.5 and just over 11 feet above mean high water on the Falmouth shore of Buzzards Bay. This was a Coast Guard ship that was ripped up off of its anchors and was floating around on the waterfront in Falmouth. There was a story of a man named John McLaughlin. He had received a call from his neighbor, Martha Winnick, asking if his daughter, Jean, could come over and babysit. They said they had an important engagement. And so McLaughlin was a little more worried about all these waves that were starting to come off Vineyard Sound. He knew what was going to happen. He knew that there was a bad storm in the making. And he just told her, get out of your house, get out of the house. But it ended up being too late. 2 hours later, she and her 3 daughters and her sister all perished during the storms when the storm surge of Carol swept over the road and carried their house like a cork into Great Pond, smashed it to pieces. And out here on the Cape, I was told of this story by Lydia Moore. She was a kid back in 1954, and she was 13 years old. And along with her aunt, 2 cousins, and 2 friends, they went out on a camping trip to Sampson Island in Pleasant Bay. Ended up riding out the storm before they had to be rescued by the Coast Guard. Now, they went out there, they've been planning this for years, and even her father said, yeah, go ahead, sure thing, go ahead. Well, they went out and she said they had a ball. They had a great time, but it was pouring rain, the wind was blowing, and they had everything they could want inside this tent, even their dog and everything, all kinds of good stuff to eat. And people on land began to panic. And that's when they sent the Coast Guard duck boat out to get them. And then when they got back, she was thinking to herself, oh my God, I can only imagine what these other kids' parents are thinking, letting us go on this, but she said it was a great time. That was during Hurricane Carol. A couple weeks later, you had Edna, September 11th, 1954. It had 2 storm surges, which is pretty unusual. Only on Cape Cod can that happen. First on Nantucket Sound and then on the bay, when it went by. So that, so you had this monster storm surge that came into Wellfleet Harbor and all the other beaches along the Cape, in the base, on the bay side. Another lightship near disaster during this storm was, the Nantucket lightship endured 2 hours of hell, but somehow this one survived. This 959-ton floating lighthouse, everything about it was getting beat up, bow plate smashed, rudder gone, bridge almost demolished. Roped into port under tow, and aboard was a 12-man crew who couldn't have abandoned ship even if they wanted to. And somehow they lived to tell about it. They could never explain how that they were able to survive this. Now this one, I'm gonna jump ahead now to 1978. People here in Eastham, if you were here, you remember it. And it's not so much that it was a blizzard here in Eastham. Oh, outside of Boston, it was one of the most devastating snowstorms they ever saw. Here on Cape Cod, it was more of a tidal event than it was a snow event. This picture here is Coast Guard Beach down the road. What was left of the bathhouse on Coast Guard Beach. And this scene drew thousands of people to Coast Guard Beach after the storm, or during the storm, actually. The forecast was pretty standard for what you would think a nor'easter would have, 8 to 16 inches of snow. There was more than that in many areas outside of Boston. Some areas south and west of Boston had 3 to 4 feet of snow during that storm. 15-foot snow drifts. Here on the Cape, it ended up turning to rain pretty quickly. And there was also the big factor here was this high tide that happened at new moon on Monday, February 6th of 78. 14.5 feet above mean low water. That means 4 feet above normal. The high winds were hurricane force, 92 miles an hour officially, 120 unofficially. Coast Guard Beach's bathhouse and the parking lot were completely destroyed. And a 50-foot long concrete septic tank was unearthed near that bathhouse. This was the scene, if you look south from Coast Guard Beach, from the Coast Guard station, over that beach, the barrier beach. Completely overrun in almost every spot. This was the scene from the air. This is Conrad Nobley's butterfly house. This architectural marvel that Nobley had built out on the beach. And it was a victim of these storm tides during this storm. And this was after the storm, just flipped on its side. And of course, Henry Beston's outermost house was also a casualty of this storm. Beston had built this house in the 1920s as sort of a writing refuge for himself. He ends up writing a book called The Outermost House that was published in 1928. And the house survived a lot of storms over the years, but it didn't survive this one. It ended up being washed away too, and that was it forever. This was before the storm and after the storm. Top photo shows it in the dune. That's what was left after the storm got over. The entire beach was overrun by the storm. Just a few posts standing on what looked like a sandbar. And that's Conrad Nobley on the right, along with Henry Lind, the town's longtime natural resources officer. And there's a few pieces that were left from the outermost house. Forecastle, as Beston called it. And this was some more of the scenes of the bathhouse. The top right-hand picture is what it looked like on the beach. You can see the Coast Guard station way up in the background. And that's that little bathhouse. There's that bathhouse. And there was a huge parking lot too, in front of that whole area. And then you had the beach. So that just shows you how much things have changed since then. That's the bathhouse getting battered by these waves. And in attendance with many other people, over 3,000 people showed up to watch this during the day because the eye of the storm had an eye and it passed over Eastham. Much like the Portland Gale did. Portland Gale also developed an eye, even though they were both nor'easters. They developed an eye like a hurricane. That's how intense they were. And in attendance there was Robert Finch, the late nature essayist. And Finch told me about 10 years ago, he said, there were hundreds of people there watching the waves smash up against the bathhouse. And with every waves, he said, the crowds would just cheer. And he said, I said, why is that? What are we cheering about? You know, and he just kind of smiled afterwards. And he said, that stuck in my mind, that whole scene.
Yeah.
Now, this scene here was a Volkswagen Beetle with a group of kids, high school age, who had driven down at night, the Monday night of the storm, to watch the waves come in and, you know, feel the effects of the storm, which a lot of people like to do. Well, this didn't turn out so well for them. Fortunately for them, they escaped with their lives. But as they were driving down into the parking lot, they couldn't see that it was in the dark, and all they had were their own lights from the car. And as they're driving, the waves began breaking in behind them. So they don't know what's going on, and all of a sudden, one wave comes underneath their car, picks it up, and carries them into the marsh in the back. And they're being thrown around inside this Volkswagen Beetle, not knowing, oh my God, what's happening? Are we gonna die? And they're being thrown around, and finally they spot up in the parking lot back at the Coast Guard station, there was some lights on, somebody else's car had lights on. They said that's what saved them. They were able to get a beat on where they were. They got out of the car, got through the water, and climbed up that hill to safety. And they were fortunate because they said if they hadn't seen that, they probably would have perished. So the next day, they ended up going to the car ended up being towed out of the marsh, and it was brought to Orleans to be worked on. And they got it up there and changed all the fluids in the car, put the key in the ignition, and the thing didn't start. It's amazing because that usually is not the case with salt water incident. The Volkswagen should have been there to make a commercial, that's for sure. And you know, so that was pretty amazing because a lot of other cars got caught in salt water during that storm, and they weren't as fortunate. During that storm too, both sides from the bay and from the marsh flooded southeast there. So along Governor Prince Road was underwater, as was part of Route 6 there. People were trying to drive through in some spots there. That ruined a lot of cars. But most people, yeah, you could not get from Eastham to Orleans during the high tide cycles during that storm.
What year was that again?
78. And so it was a pretty bad scene for a lot of people. This was the scene in Provincetown, right near the Lobster Pot restaurant. And there was a few feet of water on Commercial Street as well, as there was during the Portland Gale. A lot of similarities I found between the Portland Gale and the blizzard of 78. Monomoy Island ended up being split into 3 pieces during that storm. Huge waves broke through the 30-foot dunes at Boston Beach. That was the first storm to flood the Panic River. That's a regular occurrence during big storms now. All right, I'll jump ahead now to January 2nd, 1987. This was a game changer in Chatham because it broke through, the ocean broke through Chatham Bar for the first time in anybody's memory. And it accounted for, there were 68-mile-an-hour wind gusts in Chatham. Not a lot of snow here on the Cape, off Cape, yes, but here on the Cape, again, it was more of a tidal event. And what ended up happening was because the ocean finally broke through there, and it's broken through in different places now, on so many occasions, and it's tough to keep track of it. But the reason for the high waters during this storm was something called syzygy, spelled S-Y-Z-G-Y, syzygy. And that term describes the celestial lineup of Earth, Moon, and Sun when the Moon aligns directly opposite the Earth and Sun, or between the two bodies. The alignment bulges the tides in some areas of the Earth, and that's what happened here. So it cut a 200-yard swath through what is now North Beach, directly across from the Chatham Coast Guard Station. And the inlet grew pretty quickly. By January 16th, 1 hour after high tide, the inlet measured 405 feet across. By February 3rd, right before high tide, it measured 1,600 feet plus. So erosion occurred along the northern tip of the newly created South Beach, while the southern tip of North Beach extended somewhat further south. I actually talked to Graham Geis from the Center for Coastal Studies about this. He was watching this very closely for many years, and he went into great detail explaining the whole thing. It's all in the book. But this shows here, the top one here shows, you can see Chatham Bar, it's all one piece, and then it breaks up into North Beach and South Beach on the bottom there. So you had that big break, and now the breaks have, some have filled in, but others have opened up. So it's a constant cycle that's going on there. So now back to another hurricane, and a very busy year too, which was 1991. August 19th of 1991 is when Hurricane Bob hit. That is the last actual hurricane to have hit Cape Cod. We've had a few tropical storms and near misses from some hurricanes, but Bob was the last one to really, really hit us. Wind gusts of 125 miles an hour in Brewster and North Truro. High sustained winds of 100 miles an hour in North Truro. Storm surges of 12 to 15 feet in the Buzzards Bay area and on Vineyard Sound as well. This was the scene at the Sandcastle Resort, the border of Provincetown and North Truro. It's actually on the Provincetown side. It was, it had its roof ripped off during Hurricane Bob. Actually, several places lost their lids during Hurricane Bob, but this was the scene there at the Sandcastle Resort. And I was pretty familiar with this area. I used to stay in a house that my in-laws owned, almost right next door to it for many years. So I knew the neighborhood pretty well. And I noticed that that whole thing there, and then I read about this later on. I couldn't believe it. And that this had happened right next door there. So I stopped by there early last year, and the general manager there dug up these old photographs for me to use. And she also said, you know, I was living on Commercial Street during Hurricane Bob. And she said she wasn't working for the resort at the time, but she said, I went outside during the storm because it was mostly a lot of wind out here. There wasn't a lot of rain. So she went outside and watched it. The wind was howling like crazy. And she said there were people out in the street having hurricane parties. They were having a ball. And she said, all of a sudden I turned and I saw a roof fly by. Somebody's roof had blown off and it flew by me. She said, that's when I got back in the house after that. But it did. It happened to several places in Provincetown during that storm. This is the windmill just in Orleans. Lost a couple of its blades. And this is also the Oddfellows Hall on Nipscake Road. Lost some of its siding during the storm. So that was just a brief look at what happened during, Hurricane Bob. Cause just 2 months later, we got hit with another storm. And how to classify this one, it was kind of hard, because nobody was really sure what to say or what to call it. We know it now as the perfect storm. Everybody calls it the perfect storm. It was at the time referred to as the Halloween gale or the no-name storm, because it was actually a combination of several different weather systems. They actually considered classifying it as a hurricane, but the various branches of NOAA all decided against this to avoid unnecessarily confusing and alarming the public. Now, it said it gave Cape Cod a Great Gale 91, gives Cape Cod a new look. But it was so many different factors involved here. There was a fading hurricane named Grace coming up from the south that was losing it, but its energy was being absorbed by a developing low pressure area off of Canada, off the Canadian maritime area. And also there was a cold front also barreling through, a very strong one. So you have these three systems all coming together, boom, out at sea. And it started up there off of Newfoundland, and it kind of wound its way down past Cape Cod, looped around down near Virginia almost, and then back up into Canada before it finally ran out of gas. So it was a storm that nobody could really explain. But what it did was it just kept the ocean churning with very high tides for several days. You had wind gusts of 78 miles an hour in Chatham, 79 in Provincetown. A weather buoy off of Nova Scotia recorded a wave exceeding 100 feet. So you know where they got the idea in the movie The Perfect Storm, when George Clooney's trying to drive the boat up over that giant wave. That's where they got the idea. They never knew what happened to the Andrea Gale. But in this case, they did know there were extreme waves out there. And also, just east of the Cape, there were wave heights that were approaching 40 feet. So it was, and there was several days of this. Down on Chatham, down in Chatham in the North Beach area, Bruce and Donna Edson had been through their share of storms, and they were staying down there on North Beach in their place, and they knew something wasn't quite right leading up to during this storm when it was hitting. They were marooned there eventually, but thanks to several neighbors and friends who staged what Donna Edson called a heroic rescue by ORVs, they were taken ashore. So they couldn't get a boat, they couldn't get a helicopter to go out there, the weather conditions were too extreme for either one. But somehow these ORVs got out there, and the rescuers described it as the ride off the beach was pedal to the metal. Your foot is stuck right to the floor and the transmissions are heating up, the sand is nothing but soup, and you're sinking in. So if you stop, you're gonna get stuck, and the adrenaline is pumping. Nauset Light Beach lost 10 feet of cliff during that storm. And 3 structures, including Henry McCusker's boathouse right along Nauset Marsh, was washed away. This picture up here is from 2005. That's me on the right. That's my friend John March with me on the left. We're standing on what was left from Henry McCusker's boathouse. We had found it. We were walking around down there one day. This was up right near Hemingway Landing. And we were walking around and we noticed it in the woods and we said, what the heck is that? And we went and looked at it and I asked around after a while, and sure enough, yes, that's what it was. It was McCusker's boathouse. I went looking for it again last year. I couldn't find it. So it's probably either somebody took it for firewood or it just got washed away again. Also in Truro, the Pamut River at Boston Beach saw an 82-foot cut created by high surf. 82 feet as opposed to the 30 feet from the blizzard 78. And the Grays Beach boardwalk, 1,000 feet long in Yarmouth washed away. Mildred Champlin was one of the dune dwellers up in Provincetown. Mildred is in her 90s now, still occasionally visits up there. And she lives off Cape, but she described this when she went back. I have descriptions from her of the dune area from both the 78 blizzard and from the perfect storm. And she said at the week after they had left the Cape, Friday, November 1st, they came back because they had heard about the storm. And they observed all the damage that had happened. She said the house had gone through 5 days of that enormous storm, 10 high moon tides. Clambering out of the car, racing to the dune's edge, we were stunned to be looking down rather than out over the 100 feet of grass we had a week ago. And the storm had clawed away maybe 75 feet of our frontage. The ocean was lapping almost at our feet, and she said you could also, the pipe that was there used to be underneath, and you could go underneath it. That's how much things had changed. So, you might recognize this. The shucking house on Collins Cove, as you're coming into Eastham down by the Rotary. So, this is just summarizes everything now that happened. During the blizzard of 78, this was, that shucking house flooded because that area was heavily flooded during that storm. And following storms, it got even worse. So there was, and Ken Collins, late Ken Collins, used to mark the level the storms have reached in the same way a lot of people measure the growth of their kids. You know, they get against the wall and you put, you know, the date and how tall the kid is. Well, that's what was happening with these storms. The 78 storm is marked about shin high. The big storm of 87 is waist high. The marks of 91 need no ink. They cover the garage. So 1991 is the winner here. But if you ask people on other parts of the Cape, what's the worst storm? Well, Falmouth might tell you the 1938 hurricane. Dennis might tell you the 1944 hurricane. So it kind of varies what part of the Cape that you're on. So is the worst yet to come? I'm not trying to start a panic here or anything, but yeah, very, very possible. One thing, Glenn Field from the National Weather Service told me, he said they often quote this Japanese proverb, natural calamity strikes at just about the time that one forgets its terror. So especially that applied to 1938, when nobody knew what was coming, and also people had no idea of the strength of what was coming. And again, now we're at the point where we haven't seen an actual hurricane here in a very long time. There's a whole generation of people who've never seen it. A worst case scenario, he said, is a storm with the potency of the 38 hurricane moving over New England again. He said, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when it will happen. He said, in this case, a northern movement of the storm making landfall near Foxwoods in Connecticut would have a 20-foot surge in Narragansett Bay, in Rhode Island. If you bring the storm up Narragansett Bay, then the water has nowhere to go in Buzzards Bay. It's the flow around the storm, the way it drives these, the storm surge. So if you bring the storm up Narragansett Bay, the water has nowhere to go in Buzzards Bay, there would be 30 feet of water at Parkwood Beach in Wareham, 30 feet. Hurricane Katrina's maximum storm surge was 25 feet. Remember that from 2005. So imagine getting a Hurricane Katrina here. And the other thing to keep in mind is, yeah, all the damage that happened in 1938, now take into account all the coastal development that has happened since 1938, building along the coast. If that happens, if you get something like that hitting with all the building that's got, it's going to be devastating. And fixing it, everything will take not just days or weeks, months, or maybe even years before it's fixed. The Weather Service did a whole report as to what would happen if it hit Connecticut and Massachusetts and that area. Hospitals would be shut down for extended periods of time if this sort of thing happened. So keeping all these storms in mind, Mildred Champlin said this after she came back. She said after the perfect storm, she said, we viewed the devastation and I said, I'd never again look forward predicting the future. All we know is that Mother Nature is in charge and we have to be grateful for all the years we've had and enjoy right now. So far, we've been lucky. Another perfect storm will come in the future. We know that. This picture was from 2018 down at Northern Lake, when, this was when they had first built that new path going down there. And because the stairway kept getting washed away, and this was what had happened, it started flooding during that day. I had to run away from it myself. It was a pretty crazy scene. That also, spelled the end for the house that was across from Nauset Lake. They had to take down that house. And there's a lot of other houses now that are being threatened along that stretch. After Hurricane Bob, the Cape Codder newspaper, the editor must have grabbed one of the reporters and said, "Hey, call the Orleans Senior Center and see how they made out over there. They see how the seniors did." And they got the director on the phone, and she said, "The seniors, they didn't have any problems." He said, "They all know what to do." She said, "It's young people like us who had to figure things out. We think we live in such a sophisticated world, but nature humbles us." So that brings us to a conclusion. I just want to let you know, I do talks like this all over the place here in Eastham. I had several this past year on this very subject. I got more talks coming up in Norwell, Foxborough, and Hyannis in the coming year. During early 2025. Next summer, I'll be leading some history walks at Cape Cod National Seashore through the efforts of the Harwich Conservation Trust and the Eastham Conservation Foundation. I'll have more details on that in the spring. All these events get listed on my website, which is dwcapecod.com/events. I have business cards over here afterwards if you want to check that out. And yeah, I'm at work now on another book, and this is coming out in sometime in 2026, Prohibition on Cape Cod, Running in the Rum. Yes, this was a very hectic area for rum running, the entire Cape, but yes, even here in Eastham. I got quite a few stories in there from things that happened on the Bayside, where they were bringing booze in, illegal contraband. And some of the newer books, some of the most recent books I've written, Historic Storms of Cape Cod, that's available here for $24.99. I also have Cape Cod and the Portland Gale for $23.99, and Shipwrecks of Cape Cod, Stories of Tragedy and Triumph, that's $21.99. This also have, got to add on tax for that. Cash or credit is welcome. And that brings us to a conclusion. Anybody have any questions?
No, but I'll apply.
Yeah. When you talk about the longitude of the, what was it, 72?
Yeah,
Does that apply to some of the other storms or strictly hurricanes?
pretty much hurricanes. Yeah, the other storms, like nor'easters, a lot of them tend to be combinations of storms. One storm will develop in the Gulf of Mexico. Usually it's something that comes out of, sweeps across the country, redevelops over the Gulf of Mexico, and then it moves up the eastern seaboard. That's how a lot of nor'easters develop. Sometimes they combine with other systems as well. But that's their typical path. Hurricanes, yeah, they'll end up over the Bahamas, there, that general area of the Caribbean. But some of them take unusual paths too, like the ones over Florida that happens, cutting across from west to east, very unusual pattern. A lot of them will develop off the coast of Africa and cross the ocean, and then maybe make their way up. It depends which way the jet stream takes them. So you're kind of at the mercy of however the jet streams are working. Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, you covered all these different storms, but historically, is there many records of the earlier storms from the?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So-
If you go back, I went back as far as the Portland Gale.
Yeah.
There was a pretty severe nor'easter in 1851 that destroyed the lighthouse in Scituate. There's also the Greek colonial hurricane of 1635. It's written about from Plantation. Of that storm, it was supposedly a 25 foot storm surge in Buzzards Bay from that. Details I'm amazed they had as many details as they did
Yeah.
from those days.
Yeah.
So again, the technology and the record keeping wasn't there, for a lot of these other storms. You have to go way, way back to find them, but I took some of the more recent ones.
Yeah.
But yeah, there were some monster storms too.
Yeah.
1841, there was an October storm that killed a lot of Cape Cod mariners at sea, that I wrote about in my shipwrecks book. Where 56 men, I think it was, from Truro died, 57 men from Truro were killed at sea during that storm. And several other towns were also affected on the Cape from it. So, yeah, there were plenty of others as well. And just don't go back that far.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
I have another question. This is more recent times. Our mom was from Orleans, and so we used to summer at our grandparents' house down Tonsa Road
Yeah,
in Orleans.
We're still
And
there.
the house is still there, yep, still with family. But we all know now where the inlet is. But when I was a kid, back in the 50s, it was down in front of Nauset Heights.
mhm,
And then at some point, again, we weren't here year round, it was just summer times. But at one point, there were two inlets. We broke through with second place. And of course, now it's up where it is now.
you're mentioning the Nauset Marsh Inlet there.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Yeah,
So it's changed over the years, and were any of these storms the cause of that?
78 I know did, and
Okay.
some of the ones that I didn't talk about today in the early 90s were also affecting it. But as a rule, that Nauset Marsh Inlet, it moves from south to north, as opposed to a lot of other marshes. They work differently. They go from north to south. This one goes from south to north. It moves gradually north. And as it moves gradually north, it starts to fill in, and then another one
Yeah.
opens to the south. So that's the way that routine, that
Yeah.
cycle.
So is that where we're headed in the future? Possibly coming up closer to the Coast Guard station?
Yeah, well, it did. I can remember it cutting through just to the south of the Coast Guard station.
Well, during the.
This was during the, this would have been in the 90s.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and also during, you know how when you drive up into Coast Guard Beach?
Yeah.
There's that, there's a section, like a bridge
Yeah,
that
yeah,
goes over,
yeah.
that area was flooding through too.
Yeah.
During, I think that was in the early 90s, there were a couple of storms, I go
Yeah.
into
I
detail.
mean, that's actually almost like an island.
Yeah, it
Really
kind of
complex at
was,
some
it
point.
kind of did turn it
Yeah.
into an island,
Yeah,
yeah. I go into detail on some of these other storms too in the book.
Okay,
In the early 90s, there was that 1990 storm that, uncovered an entire, Native American settlement that had been there, and they had to dig it up real quick, because it was gonna get covered up again. And then in 92, there was another storm where the tides were so bad in this area, that was one of the highest tides they had recorded in, at the Collins, shucking house there. But it was such a high tide, it messed up the patterns of some pilot whales. They ended up swimming up the Pamet River in Truro and had to be rescued. A lot of them didn't make it. And it also flooded the Stop and Shop parking lot down in Orleans, because that's Jeremiah's gutter area.
Yeah.
And that area flooded during that storm, and they announced over the PA during that storm, attention shoppers, it is now high tide in the parking lot. Because that was a pretty severe storm. So I go into a lot of those other ones. I also go into a lot of storms from this century.
okay,
I got a whole chapter on that of going from 2005, where we had that blizzard in January of that year. We had like 3 feet of snow here. And then there was the, they called it the Sting Jet storm in December of 2005. It was like a hurricane hit all of a sudden. 100-mile-an-hour winds in some places. And nobody knew what it was. It was just because of this unusual weather, these things that happened during this storm, it all came together and just exploded right in Cape Cod Bay. But dolphins were beaching and everything because of it. And I go all the way through some of the tornadoes and a few of the other things as well. So it's, there's a lot of stuff in there. All right, I think we're ready to wrap things up. Thank you for coming.
Meet the heck name.
Have you done?
Oh, 2016, we got storm, I mean, the house was built.